First of all, I'm based in New York. Lloyd's has 6 offices in the U.S. and 2 in Canada that I'm responsible for. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Lloyd's market. I changed the title on Richard to Lloyd's in the next 327 years. That sort of incorporates the access and underwriting piece and the innovation into our views on how we can be relevant for another 327 years. This is not meant to be an advertisement for Lloyd's, but for those of you who don't know Lloyd's very well, we essentially are the focal point of insurance and reinsurance for a lot of the businesses around the world. State Farm, Farmers, any of you who buy directly from an insurance company, a lot of their business is reinsured back to Lloyd's. I'll show you a slide in a little bit where we have a lot of the U.S. insurance companies who actually have Lloyd's platforms. So I'm in essence trying to advocate on behalf of the entire industry, a lot of it which originated in the London market. So I'm going to talk about what Lloyd's is, what we insure, what we do in the U.S., a little bit about modernizing Lloyd's. For those of you who are cover holders, I saw Jim Rowe back there. You're probably saying, oh, brother, another person from Lloyd's talking about modernizing the market. Well, I'm going to give it a shot, Jim. Emerging risk and innovation, and then Q&A. This is the Lloyd's building on Lime Street in the center of the financial district in London. It's a Richard Rogers creation. He's the same architect who did the Pompidou Center in Paris. It's essentially an inside-out building. Everything that's normally on the inside of the building is on the outside of ours. Bathrooms, stairwells, elevators, HVAC. It's done that way to make for a very efficient use of space. We'll talk about that in a second. You either love it or you hate it. It's extremely expensive to take care of, as you can imagine. Does anybody know who owns this building? Ping An Insurance Company. Richard opened with remarks about how the Chinese are investing all over the world. They're not only investing in Lloyd's as a syndicate or two. China Re has been there for a couple of years now, but they recently bought the Lloyd's building, and it was one of their largest investments to date in the London marketplace at all. We're clearly the best known, least understood brand in the insurance and insurance. Leader's Edge is the monthly magazine of the Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers. They put together a cover story on the London market, not just Lloyd's, and just, again, for explanation purposes, the London market is a big part of what goes on over there, both from a direct insurance and reinsurance perspective. The Lloyd's market is just part of it. We're a little bit larger, but overall it's about $85 billion in direct and reinsurance, which is funnels through that London market every single year. It's about a 2 square mile area emanating out from the Lloyd's London building. So right in the heart there, why they chose the word epicenter for a marketplace that writes a lot of property cat business, I don't know, but they did a terrific job of profiling the Lloyd's and the London market in that article. It's from last October. Now Lloyd's is a marketplace. It's not an insurance company. So if you are insured with a policy from Lloyd's, it won't say Lloyd's Insurance Company. It'll have underwriters at Lloyd's and then list the different syndicates by their participation on the risk. We have a long history of taking risks dating back to 1688. It all started in Everett Lloyd's coffee shop. I'm just going to do a brief historical piece here because we can all read books, we can all go on websites of any number of organizations to find out about Lloyd's. But essentially, you had ship owners sending cargoes, ships and cargoes across the seas. You had wealthy people sitting around whiling away the hours at Everett Lloyd's coffee shop. Over time, the stock stories of the merchants whose ships didn't come home resonated with these wealthy people who were sitting around all day drinking coffee. That was the morning, of course, and after different things happened. They decided to pool their capital and provide insurance coverage for these ship owners. And you'll see there's a picture of the interior of the Lloyd's building there with the rostrum. That's where a bell hangs. It's called a routine bell. And historically, when a ship wouldn't come back, there would be one bell ring on that. All the underwriters would have to pitch up their checkbooks out. If the ship did in fact come back a couple of days later, the bell would ring twice. They'd all essentially breathe a sigh of relief. So a long history over there. We insure primarily complex and specialty risks. We don't write workers' comps, thankfully. You know, Rob was talking about all the great opportunities in that business, and not so much the excess comp. Lloyd's reinsures a lot of the comp writers in the U.S., but we're not in the primary comp business. We also don't write personal auto here in the U.S. We write a lot of long-haul transportation. It's a London-based business, obviously. Performance management director is really important, and I'll talk about that for a second. Those of you who were around back in the late 80s, early 90s, remember that Lloyd's almost went off the cliff. Time magazine had a famous cover story with a tombstone that said Lloyd's R.I.P. essentially what Lloyd's got in trouble for after about 280 or so years of being in business was a combination of the Piper Alpha oil platform disaster in the North Sea, Hurricane Andrew, but most importantly, U.S. litigation around environmental risk and asbestos. Those were the classic emerging risks at the time. Underwriters and Lloyd's didn't understand the U.S. legal environment. They got whacked really hard. Because of that, many syndicates went out of business. At the time, there were about 400 different syndicates of Lloyd's. Now there are, I think, 96, 97. They were all supported 100% by individual names capital. And these were people who pledged their entire assets to a Lloyd's syndicate. They were all individuals globally. It worked really well for hundreds of years until it didn't. So as a result of that, Lloyd's put in this performance management directorate that essentially spends the latter half of every year looking at business plans that syndicates have to submit before they're able to write business on January 1st. We're in the thick of that right now, and it's our effort at Lloyd's. One thing I didn't tell you about was I work for the Corporation of Lloyd's. Essentially, we are the platform. We're a classic turnkey operation. If you're an investor with capital, you have underwriters, and you want to bring them together on a platform that gives you access to 200 countries around the world, and have somebody else do all the backroom work for you, make sure the licenses are maintained, regulatory affairs work is done, you come to Lloyd's. So, again, back in the late 80s, early 90s, there were 400 syndicates, 15 or 20,000 names around the world. That's all changed. This performance management director makes sure that all the syndicates writing business at Lloyd's currently have underwriters that understand it, have claims paying expertise, are charging appropriate rates. You know, upstream energy, for all of you in the Texas area know, is a real classic case of put up your rate structure for next year and cut it in half, cut up your price. It's a real tough business to be in. So we're not necessarily putting up a lot of new capacity for energy business right now. Because our platform is global, we're able to reallocate capital and capacity around the world to areas we think are a better return on our investments. I'll talk about those in a second. And then we're heavily regulated by the Prudential Regulatory Authority and the Financial Conduct Authority. The PRA focuses more on your ability to pay claims, your capital solvency. The FCA are the regulators of conduct of brokers in the London market and by extension around the world. Most importantly, for the cover holders in the room, cover holders are a Lloydsism. I'll try to use very few of those today. There are MGAs with a Lloyd's pen. We have about 4,500 around the world, over 1,000 here in the U.S. That's about 30% of our global distribution. It's a very efficient way of getting the word out. And instead of having people come to London for everything, they can just go down the street to a local cover holder and get their business done that way. For those of you who are brokers in the room, of course, it's very important. We're strictly a broker market. Again, 96 syndicates, 300 cover holders. Lloyd's brokers are those registered in the London market to bring you either as a cover holder or an insured in London. We do business in over 200 countries. This is the inside of that building. It's 12 stories high. The first 4 floors are the underwriting room. This is where all of the syndicates operating in Lloyd's have their boxes. It's essentially a place where throughout the day, brokers from around the world bring their business into Lloyd's, and they go from one box to another. If you're looking to place a pretty complex property program, you essentially, as a Lloyd's broker, you know who to go see in that property area of the room, who would one of the syndicates would be the best place to do your business for you. You bring the business in, you shop it around the room. It's a classic marketplace. If you can't get it all done in Lloyd's, you can go out to the London market across the street to our competitors and get it done out. It's a very interesting process. A lot of the more complex risks of Lloyd's are done on a space-based basis. A lot of our business, though, as I mentioned, is done by cover holders in the U.S. and around the world. And we're also looking at different ways to perhaps bring business closer to the consumer down the road. I'll talk about that in a second. There's that bell down at the bottom of the page. That's where the rostrum where the routine bell hangs. You're welcome to look at it. If any of you are going to London and you want to see the Lloyd's building, feel free to let me know. We have tours there. We'd be happy to give you a tour. For the men, you have to wear a tie if you don't have one. We have a huge box in the basement. You can pull one out. It's been done many times, believe me. Here's that London market snapshot. The top is $40 billion. That's the London market. You know, that's ACE, who also has a Lloyd's platform. They also have a large European business based in London. It's Swiss Re, it's Zurich. Neither of them have Lloyd's platforms. And then below that would be the Lloyd's market. It's about $43 billion. So we like to say that if you can't get it done in the London market, it probably can't be done. This slide you can't see. And by the way, this presentation will be available if you want it. These are all the logos of the managing agents. The managing agent is an insurance company or a capital provider who's responsible for running the syndicates. So there are 58 of them running 96 syndicates. Beasley, for example, probably a pretty well-known name here, has 5 syndicates. Hiscox has 2. Some of them only have 1. Munich Re, a very conservative German reinsurance company, actually has 2 syndicates. Travelers is there, Chubb, Hartford, Liberty Mutual. A lot of U.S.-based insurance companies have a platform with Lloyd's, not to write business here in the U.S. necessarily, but to access countries they wouldn't otherwise be able to. Some are really large, like Catlin. They're the biggest. XL is a real small syndicate. They've obviously merged now, so XL has an even larger platform as XL Catlin in the Lloyd's market. Capital, the top of that wheel, you have at 2%. Those are the unlimited names. There are still names out there, people who pledged their entire asset base to the Lloyd's marketplace, to the syndicates they're writing business in, and there's still a few of those left. As time goes on and they pass on, that will become 0. We look to the right there, that's some of the capital that comes from around the world. I mentioned ACE earlier, QBE, Mitsui, Munich Re. Bermuda has a fair amount of capital there, the U.S. market. 30% there, as you move to the left, is still the largest contribution of capital to the Lloyd's market, and that's from the British insurance companies, Hamlin, Hiscox, Brit. And then you have 9% unlimited liability members. If you were out there and you wanted to invest either with your company or personally in a Lloyd's syndicate, you could do that with a special purpose syndicate. It's a way for you to get your foot in the door there, but you have a limited liability exposure to that. Because nobody wants to be in a business where you're going to someone and saying, give me your farm, or your syndicate needs some money. Those days are long gone. I'm going to show you this real quickly. 44% of Lloyd's business is in the USA and Canada. 38% is in the US. It's about $9 billion in E&S business. That's the bulk of our business here. We're the largest E&S writer in the US. About $4.5 billion is reinsurance. And a very small amount, less than $200 million, is on our licensed platforms in the USVI, Kentucky, and Illinois. They've been there about 75 years. So it makes sense that the US and Canada, some of the earliest industrializing nations would have the largest footprint for Lloyd's. A lot of the more complex risks in the world are here. And our 2 countries also have some of the most severe exposure to natural catastrophe in the world. Everything happens in this North American continent. Some years not a lot. Some years you can't spend a day without a tornado or an earthquake or a major conflagration or something. So it makes sense, since we do a lot of that type of business as well, that Lloyd's would be very large in North America. We're growing rapidly in Asia. Singapore, there's a mini Lloyd's platform that touches the entire Asian area. And in the UK, we're 18%. Brazil, we have a platform as well for reinsurance only. This slide, the point of this slide is just to show you that the reinsurance in the US is about 24%. It ranges from 24% in the US to 74% in Brazil, and that shows our classes of business all the way down. Financial results. The important piece here, Rob touched on return on capital for investment in any kind of insurance organization. If you look at 2010, go straight to the bottom, the return on capital for investors in the Lloyd's market was about 12%. That was a relatively tough year. It started with the Chile earthquake. We had a Deepwater Horizon oil rig, which was insured in Lloyd's. Not the environmental piece of it, fortunately. That was insured in the BP captive. But Lloyd's had the physical damage on the rig itself. There were a lot of U.S. tornadoes, Midwestern problems, and then you had Australian floods and New Zealand earthquakes. So all that considered, it was a relatively tough year for Lloyd's, but we came in at 93% combined ratio, returning 12%. That's when we all, as an industry, started seeing some of the capital that Rob mentioned coming into our industry. The alternative capital, we like to call it. I just like to call it capital. It's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. Look what happened in 2011 with the Hukou earthquake, followed by the tsunami, followed by the Thai floods, followed by a lot of disasters around the world where we all lost a lot of money. Most of these people who were investing their capital, whether through ILS or other means, they just reloaded. They just wrote checks and off they went. There wasn't even a glitch in the marketplace. More capital poured in, and that's not about to change, in my opinion. I show you 2011 there. That's when we had a real rough year as an industry. Our loss ratio, combined ratio, was about 107%, and we lost 3% on capital. So people essentially wrote the year off, and you know, if there were no losses, right, we'd all be doing something else. 2012 was a decent year at 15%. 2013 was our best year in a long time, with 16% return on capital. So you can kind of see the trend here. As our industry, even in a relatively tough year, returns 10% or more on capital invested. Who out there is running a hedge fund, a pension fund, you name the industry financial vehicle, they're going to want to look at our industry really, really hard. And they are in a big way. Our challenge as the industry is to convince them to invest in things other than cat property, which they know after the year is over they've either won or lost. Let's look at some other things, whether it's drones, autonomous vehicles, cyber risk, places that we as an industry are really comfortable insuring and spend a lot of money understanding, but don't do enough in yet of way of offering risk transfer solutions. Lloyd's is rated A+ by S&P, AA- by Fitch, and A by AM Best. Really, really important to us because prior to our troubles back in the early 90s, we didn't have ratings. It was sort of a Wild West environment. Now it's a much more buttoned-down, safer place to do business than it's ever been. So what can be done at Lloyd's? Some of the things I talked about, satellite launches, we do pretty well in that business. But every once in a while, a $350 million satellite will go up and go straight down. Nothing to do with write a check on that one. They happen, you know. You hear about them all the time. It's usually a small little article and it's over. It usually lands in the ocean. Infrastructure projects all over the world. If you look down the bottom of renewable energy, now that's a political hot potato. I'm not going to get into what the future is of renewable energy, but Lloyd's writes about 25% of the wind farms and solar farms in the world. If anybody here is from California, I know my colleague Rich McGrath is here. He's from LA. As you drive east on I-10, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of windmills turning, and you can be mesmerized into driving off the road if you're not really careful. But Lloyd's is a big provider of that type of insurance. And then, of course, ships and cargoes. The fun stuff, which we do quite a lot of, is called contingency as a class. Troy Polamalu, recently retired Pittsburgh Steelers safety, has his hair insured in Lloyd's by Head and Shoulders. They buy a policy to protect their investment in him playing his piano after washing his hair, putting a tux on. You've all seen that commercial. Ugly Betty, just below Troy there, has her teeth insured by Crest. Keith Richards, the point of that slide is we insure a lot of musicians and athletes' body parts. We also do a lot of event cancellation work. The middle bottom photo there, I don't know why we still show this. Because if you're of the millennial generation, you're saying, oh, brother, my dad's up there. It's Betty Grable. She was one of the first people, a Hollywood star back in the 40s, to insure her legs in the Lloyd's market. Santa Claus's beard, you get the point. This is not a huge part of Lloyd's business, but it is something that people tend to remember us for because it's kind of fun and quirky. Munich Re, by the way, owns the Watkins syndicate, no relation. They do a lot of this business. So those of you who think the Germans are conservative, which they are in their business, they also have some fun in Lloyd's market with this little platform. I mentioned property is a big class of business. Across the world, roughly half of Lloyd's business is property, a lot of cat business. So when the earth moves, when the wind blows, you can count on the Lloyd's market and all of our members to pay a lot of claims. When nothing happens, generally speaking, it's a pretty good year for Lloyd's and allows the different syndicates there to reinvest their capital in new ways to understand risk and provide new products. Pretty much anything can be insured at Lloyd's except financial guarantees. We've always had the view that the people selling you their financial risk will always know more about it than you will, so stay far away from it. And we can understand mines, long-haul transportation. We're working on cyber risk. I don't think anybody gets that yet completely. Disability, sports, we can understand a lot of that, but financial guarantees, not a chance, and workers' comp, we stay away from it as well. Again, that's statutorily regulated. We're an E&S market in the U.S., so it's not a place to play with anyway. In the U.S. market, 56% of our business is surplus lines, 36 reinsurance, 7 exempt, 1% license. These are my colleagues. We have 33 people, 32 in the U.S. rather. The bulk of them are in Kentucky, Illinois. That's where we have those licensed platforms. About 18 of them work there. The rest of us are around the country. Our primary role on behalf of the Lloyd's market is to ensure that the regulators around the country, we have about 54 jurisdictions that regulate insurance. And thankfully, that happened because in 2008 and forward, we did not see many insurance companies go out of business. You saw hundreds of community banks go out of business, which were federally regulated, but you didn't see the insurance industry take too many hits. So I'm all for state regulation. It's done us all very well. But we in all insurance organizations spend a lot of time behind the scenes to make sure that regulators understand what to do. Particularly in E&S, it's a challenge for some of them to understand it, and even more so Lloyd's. Those guys will do everything. It's hard to understand sometimes. And the regulators constantly churn. It's a great spot for someone out of law school to spend 2 or 3 years before they go on to Lloyd, PwC, wherever. So we're constantly re-educating the regulators. And that does not meant to be a complaint, it's just an observation, because regulation is critical. Obviously, without it, human nature being what it is, we'd all be looking over our shoulder every day to see who's going to take advantage of what's next. So, love regulation, but it just has to be watched very carefully, and we have to partner with them very well. Glenn Doors in Boston, he's our Northeast Region Market Development Rep. If anybody you are from up there, feel free to reach out to him. You can come to your office, give your presentation about the Lloyd's market to your clients. If you're a wholesale broker, to your retail clients, retail broker to your direct clients. His main role is education in the Lloyd's market. Rod Smith there is in Atlanta. He covers the southeast for us. Rich McGrath, I mentioned, covers the western region, and Pat Talley covers the central region. So we do everything on behalf of the Lloyd's market except underwrite and pay claims. So don't call us for a quote. We get that a lot, which is fine. We always refer the caller, who's usually an individual, either a business owner or a risk manager. We refer them back to the broker. Technically, if you're a risk manager, i.e. an educated buyer, you can go straight into the Lloyd's market without a broker. We get those calls periodically. We always tell them that the last thing you want to do is be standing there after a major loss that has no broker involved in front of your board explaining why you went solo. And they always back down. So it's very, very important. We're a huge proponent of the broker market. I'm going to keep going. We all do this stuff. I'm going to be actually out at UNT later today. I'm following Rob Schimmick all over today. I told him that earlier. He's going to UNT now. I'll be there later. So, are there any UNT students in the audience? Normally, Richard is very gracious about inviting them, but I think it's the first or second day of school, so they probably couldn't take a day off to come here. I've always really appreciated that. Accessing Lloyd's from the U.S. This is that access piece. First of all, it takes the insurance company as a cedent, would be a reinsurer, or the insurance buyer as a consumer, business owner, etc., who has the need. Without that, we'd be doing something else. The capital comes in from members, and those can be insurance companies, it can be hedge funds, pension funds, private equity firms. Any number of different investors are out there looking at the Lloyd's market these days. And like I mentioned earlier, China has a big piece of that as well, which we're thrilled about. 59 managing agents, 94 syndicates. Every presentation has a mistake. That's mine. I had 96 in the other syndicate. They tend to vary. They can go up or down every month by 1 or 2, depending on what's changing there. But it's a relatively static number. If you're insured, obviously, you first go, and this is not just to access Lloyd's, but it's to access the E&S marketplace. We would go to a retail broker. They, in turn, would get to Lloyd's through a cover holder or a wholesale broker. If you're a cedent, obviously, an insurance company ceding risk to the reinsurance market, you go to a reinsurance broker. Ultimately, both of them will go to a Lloyd's broker, of which there are about 220 right now, and they are licensed by the Corporation of Lloyd's, registered to do business in the Lloyd's market. Then there's the Corporation of Lloyd's, who I work for, who Rich works for, about 900 people around the world. About 600 of them are in London. The rest of us are all over the world. We have a large presence in China, and we have China Lloyd's Insurance Company. That model is required to call themselves an insurance company, not a market, because the Chinese regulator requires it. Depending on the country you're in, the regulators will either let you go with an insurance company model or a market model. Lloyd's, of course, the majority of our business being the market concept. A quick one, this is for the cover holders in the room, modernizing Lloyd's. Every 10 years or so, the Lloyd's market gathers all of its resources and comes to the conclusion that we have to make doing business in the Lloyd's market easier. There are any number of ways over the past 50 years that business will get there, either through wholesale brokers, through cover holders, once in a while on a direct basis, though very rarely. Lloyd's is known for its creative underwriters. You saw that room earlier in the slide presentation. Those people sit there and see risks from all over the world every single day. So if you're an aviation underwriter, you're going to see drone risks. I was actually sitting at the box of an aviation underwriter when I first joined Lloyd 6 years ago. And a broker brought in a risk, a drone manufacturer who was based in Israel, selling drones to the Nicaraguan defense industry. And the underwriter looked at it and said, "You got to be kidding me." And the broker was doing his best to convince the underwriter that it was just for weather observation purposes. And the underwriter listened patiently. They knew each other, so actually before the broker came to the box, the underwriter said, "Oh, watch this. What's he got today for him?" And ultimately, the underwriter sent him away and said, "You know that we're not going to play with this, we're not going to touch it. Come back with something we can write." And so they don't say yes to everything, certainly, but they are very good at spotting the kinds of risks they want to write. Because of that, they're very creative, very open. Lloyd's has fallen down over the years on the backroom service component of it. Policy issuance has gotten a lot better. I was a broker for many years, and it used to be, the joke was, we're taking you to Lloyd's, we get your program placed, it's everything you need and more, but your policy won't be here until after the next renewal. So that was just kind of the way it was. And prior to 9/11, that wasn't a big issue. But we all know that at 9/11, there weren't a lot of policies issued. It wasn't just Lloyd's policies, it was other companies. And that thing ended up in litigation for years until the court figured out who owed what. So because of that, contract certainty within our marketplace around the world is a critical component of customer experience now. You buy a policy, you have your coverage, you know what you're buying, and it's in writing immediately. The modernization piece is to help Lloyd's better understand how we're going to be relevant for the next 27 years. London Matters is referenced in this. I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but we commissioned Boston Consulting last year to interview thousands of people around the world, a lot of risk managers in the U.S., cover holders, industry, trade organization, executive directors, to get a sense of what their perception of Lloyd's is and was. And they all initially gave us high marks for the creativity, the innovation, for essentially getting the job done right at the front end. For the back end, it was always a struggle. So we've invested a huge amount of money. We pulled together with the London market players, we were talking about earlier, and we put together this target operating model, which we are now processing, working through, and ultimately we're going to have Lloyd's London in general as a much easier place to do business. Because if we don't get it right, especially as technology advances, people expect immediate claims payment, immediate policy issuance, immediate reconciliation of data. That's the biggest challenge we have, is the data reconciliation, because with 96 syndicates, they all receive their data differently. Some people send it in on a spreadsheet, order row fasting once a month. Others, it's done XML every single night. It's drawn from the system. So we have to get that right. Have one way to transmit data, to receive data from around the world, and we're going to get there. An individual insurance company can essentially set their own standards as to how they want data to be sent to them by the brokers. We, with 96 different syndicates, have to play with that market concept and be a lot more flexible. But we still have to get it right for all of you. Emerging risks. This is the best part of our industry. This is why we're here. We all, I think, get a sense of what emerging risk is. It's something that we have a sense of it being a challenge down the road, something we have to deal with, but we haven't yet figured it out and put together policies, rates, terms, conditions, etc. That's something that we all recognize. What we do at Lloyd's, from an emerging risk perspective, Rob touched on drones, autonomous vehicles, a lot of things which we're all thinking about. We have a horizon scanning process. That there's a team at Lloyd's that every month gets together with different syndicates and kind of throws up on a whiteboard of what are the things that are bothering you. It could be any number of things that keep them awake at night. My next slide shows a survey that we did last year of managing agents in London. It basically counts about 30 or 35 risks that they're all thinking about. After we've identified a few risks that belong in the funnel, so to speak, We'll do an evaluation of them and judge what's their significance to a particular country, particular city, to their GDP, to their health and safety of their citizens. We'll put together thought leadership pieces that we think it makes a difference. We have a terrific library at Lloyd's website, Lloyds.com, emerging risk pieces. There's the Arctic melting. There's a piece we did a couple years ago on the opportunity that presents to anybody who's involved in trade. We also talk about the downside. As the Arctic melts and sea levels rise, you clearly have a problem if you're in Hawaii, Florida, any number of states that are close to the coast or surrounded by water. But again, the opportunity for people shipping through the Arctic Circle, for mining, for drilling, is tremendous for mining and Greenland in particular. So we put together thought leadership pieces. We assess the realistic disaster scenarios, what a potential exposure, what a risk might do in terms of, again, GDP damage or health and safety damage. If you look at cyber, that again is a real challenge because you may have a cyber attack on one U.S. city, but that could have global ramifications immediately. We're not as an industry yet ready to understand what that is, but we're working very hard at that. Property is much easier. We do these realistic disaster scenarios of hurricane risk or earthquake risk within a given state. And again, all insurance organizations do this. We use a combination of models to help us determine what our ultimate loss is going to be after a force 5 hurricane through Miami, for example. And then quantifying the risk, that essentially is, we've reached a point where we as a marketplace at Lloyd's feel there is a need for a risk transfer product. We have enough syndicates in the mix behind us. There are currently about 35 syndicates at Lloyd's write cyber, for example. But 10 years ago, there were 1 or 2. So they all ultimately come together and provide a lot of their own capital to provide solutions as well as solutions themselves. You probably can't see this, but again, it's available if you want it later. But this is that survey I talked about. On the left axis is the medium-term impact, 2 to 5 years of this basket of risks. On the bottom is the uncertainty axis. Now, we're not out there predicting what's going to happen. We're just helping people understand what is uncertain in our minds and what could eventually cause problems. We've broken it down into natural environment, society, and security, and technology. So if you just look at the top there, cyber risk, straight up, that clearly has a very high medium-term impact, but it doesn't have the same uncertainty, the same concern for our members in the Lloyd's market as terrorist acts do. Now, this was done a year ago. I venture to say if we did it again this year, that would have moved further to the right of the uncertainty axis, without a doubt. We have things that are like pandemics, food safety. Pick your scary thing, and I'm not trying to be Dr. Doom here, but again, we all think about this every day on behalf of our clients. The challenge that we have as an industry is to come up with ways to provide solutions that we can get insurance companies, insurance capital providers to step behind us on. And those of you who are actually out there inventing new products, you know that you're not waiting around for the market to turn if you're a property broker, because it's not going to turn. It is what it is. That there is so much out there that we as an industry can do with just this little basket of risks that the Lloyd's is determining our problems to help provide solutions. Rob has some great emerging risk reports at AIG. We do a fair number of them ourselves. I think the difference might be is that we tend to have British institutions, whether it's Cambridge or Oxford or some of the others, do the reporting, and AIG tends to rely on U.S. academic institutions, but essentially the message is the same. We just, a couple of weeks ago, issued our drone report. That's pretty interesting, pretty scary, because until there's regulation around who is responsible for a drone accident or the operation of the drone to begin with, we as an industry have a real hard time determining how we provide coverage. Now, the Europeans are well ahead of us. If you're an operator of a drone commercially, there are certain guidelines you have to follow. You have to get licensed. There's actually a responsibility assigned to you as an operator of a drone that you don't have yet in the U.S. And we'll get there. The FAA is coming to London in a few weeks to meet with the Lloyd's market and the London market and all the aviation underwriters in that marketplace to get a sense of, as an industry, what can we do once they establish regulations both for individuals and businesses here in the U.S. to use drones. What can we do as an industry to essentially provide that support after the legal system takes over, which they will. And very, very exciting thing. You know, you've not only got the operator error component, but you've got the moral hazard piece. I don't personally have a drone, but I have some friends who do, and I think they're, as Donald Trump would say, good people, but who knows what they're going to do. Sorry. Who knows what they're going to do unless they get pretty handy that thing, right? That's a huge moral hazard for our industry to think about. But it's here. You can buy drones for $50 on Amazon. A business blackout, the second one, that was, we did a study projecting what the east coast of the U.S. would look like after a cyber attack that shut down the entire grid. There were trillions of dollars immediately in lost business, in shut down airports, in closed schools, closed hospitals, you name it. If that were to be, if that were to come to fruition, we'd be in a lot of trouble. And we've also recently done reports on solar storms and how they can accomplish the same tragedy. People tend to poo-poo that. I asked a CEO of a utility company once at a breakfast meeting what he thought about solar storms. And of course, as he would, he said, no big deal, we got it covered. But I don't know. Cyber is clearly a much more relevant threat than solar storms, but we've all got to be thinking about that. Food system shock. The Chinese bought a couple of years ago the Smithfield pork processing plant in North Carolina. They did that for one reason. They're not comfortable with their own pork processing capabilities in China, and they eat a lot of pork. So, again, investment in other countries that will help them sustain their population going forward. Food system shocks, we think about it at Lloyd's all the time. As consumers, we probably don't. You go to the store, you buy your food. For the most part, who's gotten sick lately from food poisoning? Very few of us. We take a lot for granted. But that's something that we have to constantly think about. California flood. Please don't start throwing everything from California. The Central Valley has one of the most significant flood exposures in the whole U.S. That whole system out there that delivers water from the Sierras down to Southern California is a massive infrastructure project. It's really impressive what they've done over the last 100 years. But the Central Valley, where we all get our fruits and vegetables from, is a massive sluice way. And if the rain comes this year, as they say it will with El Nino, there's going to be some incredible flooding out there that we just can't do anything about. So we issued this California flood report. We always question the timing of reports, because we were kicking around earlier this summer. We issued the flood report in the middle of a drought. I don't know, it's kind of insensitive. Or do we wait till El Nino hits and then issue it, and it's done? So we just issued it, and we've got some pretty good feedback. It's nothing earth-shattering. They all know out there what their issues are from the Central Valley. But again, it's just a matter of thought leadership. We're not saying we have the insurance solution for you guys. We're just saying there's thought leadership around this. Let's all continue to look at what our risks are and how we can best manage them. Coming up in the end here, 2011, after the natural disasters around the world that I talked about earlier, Lloyd's commissioned a study that went out and looked at the 6 or 7 major points of the globe that were hit that year. You look at Japan there on the right, $210 billion in economic damages caused by that earthquake and tsunami. Incredible stuff. $35 billion was all they had in the insurance recoveries. And Lloyd's had about $2 billion of that. That screams for opportunity, screams of opportunity for anybody who wants to invest capital, capacity, etc., in the Japanese market. You look at Thailand, right next to it, $45 billion economic loss. That was the case where you had the floods from July to December. All those gleaming industrial parks that opened their arms to the component manufacturers that had left Japan to go get their products made were flooded because the mayor of Bangkok decided to reroute some of the flood control channels. And it saved Bangkok, but it flooded all of the surrounding area. So, major issue, major challenge. We actually had a syndicate that went out of business. They got in the business of writing cat property business in Thailand the year before, and wrote a lot of that in the flood business because nothing's going to happen. But it did. So, you look around, you look at the United States, $24 billion in 2011, primarily in tornado activity. There was economic loss, and not all insured. 17 billion of that was insured, and Lloyd's had about $500 million of it. So you look at the U.S., we have a propensity for much more insurance. We're a much more developed culture, if you will, around insurance in other parts of the world. The Chinese buy very, very little insurance. They've historically relied on the government to come in after a tragedy and fix things to make it right. Sichuan earthquake in 2008, over $100 billion in economic damage. There was less than $500 million in insurance recoverable. They just didn't buy insurance because the government comes in, cleans everything up, rebuilds, and people have come to expect that. Our goal as an industry should be to convince China. This number, almost $80 billion, is what we determined through our study is the amount of insurance that could be purchased in China to protect against nat cat. They project that out over all classes of insurance risk out there. China being the largest, and it's mostly the emerging markets, although I should qualify that. China was a very emerged market 200 years ago. They just went silent. So they're essentially leading the pack of countries that have tremendous value at risk but don't insure. So for our industry as a whole, that's an incredible opportunity to redeploy our capital, take all that excess capital, and put it someplace where we can actually get the governments to get out of our business. We're an expert at assessing risk and finding solutions. Put the government's capital back, and i.e. the taxpayers' capital, back into building schools, bridges, hospitals, etc., instead of cleaning up after disasters. Leave that to us. And that's our message, not just as Lloyd, but as an entire industry. So you might guess I'm pretty bullish on the future of the industry, especially for the millennials in the audience. There's a huge amount of opportunity. Richard mentioned being a specialist is a very important aspect of the future. I fully agree with that. And there's so many ways you can go you don't have to be lamenting the fact that all this capital is dripping rains down. At the end of the day, if you're Walmart and your broker says to you, our return on equity last year was only 10%, they're going to throw you out of the room because they're lucky they get 1% return. So keep that in mind too. It's 10%, 11%, 12%, not a bad deal. This is, I think, my final slide. We're issued just a little bit of a heads up on a study we're issuing on Thursday, September 3rd, Lloyd City Risk Index. We've been building this for about the past year, and we profiled 301 cities around the world against 18 threats, both man-made and natural, and essentially are looking at what the GDP risk is going to be should something happen in either one or 50 of those cities, and the latter being a cyber attack. We're projecting $5 or $6 trillion as at risk around the world if some of these events happen. So it's going to be launched on Thursday. You can download the report from our website, Lloyds.com. And it's, again, not Lloyd saying we want to provide solutions to everybody. It's just Lloyd saying this is what we feel is coming around the corner. Profiling these cities, with a lot of us probably live in, against these 18 threats, both man-made and natural. And there are certainly drawdown pages too. Some of the bigger cities have an even more in-depth look at what their risks are. So pretty cool stuff if you're a risk person like we all are, and something to think about going forward. Again, in closing, if there weren't emerging risks and people using innovation and creativity to resolve society's issues, Lloyd would still be insuring ships and cargoes, right? But because of that, we're doing a lot more in 2014 going forward.